This is Duke University.
My name is Allison Riggs. I was born in New York but grew up in Morgantown, West Virginia. Consider that my hometown. The oldest of 4 kids. I grew up in a tight-knit family. We were very close. Didn't have a lot of extended family there, so just this internal family was pretty close-knit. My parents wanted us to go away to school. They thought it was an important learning element going out on your own. I was a National Merit Scholar, and at the time Florida was recruiting, this was when Florida wasn't in such dire financial straits, the state. And so the school had state money to recruit National Merit Scholars, and that year they had, I believe, the second highest number of National Merit Scholars in the country. Second only to MIT or an Ivy League, I can't remember. But it was a really attractive financial package, and I was the oldest of 4 children, and my dad said, I'm not really interested in spending any money on your undergrad. I might help you out with grad school if need be, but free is good, so that's why I went to Florida. I dramatically veered off of my initial intentions career-wise. I was a microbiology major in undergrad, and I spent a lot of time working in labs down in Florida, and when I would come home in the summers, I worked at in a neurotoxicology lab in West Virginia. And I realized that working in a lab is very claustrophobic. It's great if there are good people and you're working with good people, but I don't know that I would describe myself so much as a people person, but it can be very confining to just be in the same space with the same people every day. So in undergrad, I was down there during the election, the 2000 presidential election, and Alachua County, where I lived, wasn't one of the problematic counties in Florida during that election, but it was the nonstop topic of discussion for a long time down there. And I think that was probably planted a seed pretty early on about the importance of elections and political activism. I think that's probably when I started getting I had grown up with a fairly progressive father figure. I mean, my father was not very political, but he was a scientist, and so I sort of had roots in progressive politics from how I grew up, but I didn't really connect it to action until undergrad. I was pretty involved in the Law School Democrats. I was the president of that for a while, the American Constitution Society. But I spent most of my time working on the Restoration of Civil Rights Clinic. It sort of became my club. And I brought people in, and those ended up being the people working on the clinic with me ended up being my core group of friends. And the main people who I got to help me that first year in law school worked on it all 3 years. The work that we did there was really eye-opening for me. That's when I started to think critically and realize, what does political participation mean? Something different to me than to other people, and I had to start thinking about what it meant to other people. And just the work that I was doing was exposing me to people that I hadn't, people and life stories that I certainly hadn't encountered growing up where I did, and in the supportive family that I did. At the time, Florida had very restrictive laws about how you got your civil rights back following a felony conviction. So civil rights, I mean, when I talk about it now, I'm mostly focusing on the right to vote. But it can also, in Florida, it did and still does today, include the right to apply for professional licenses, the right to serve on a jury. Most states disenfranchise people who are in prison. A lot of states disenfranchise people once even when they're out of prison, but while they're still on probation or parole. A few small number of states disenfranchise people permanently, absent some affirmative action on their part to try and get those rights back. So that was what the clinic was about. Florida was one of 3 states with the worst laws on felony disenfranchisement. So what we were doing, we were helping people go through the application process. You had to apply to the Florida Office of the Board of Executive Clemency, go through tons and tons of hoops, and go up in front of the board and try and argue for why you wanted your rights back. It was a long process, an intimidating process, and so we were trying to provide a resource to folks. I was surprised that I ended up driving the clinic in a much broader way than just application assistance. We did, towards the end, we were doing canvassing, educational events at churches, radio shows. I mean, we were reaching out for clients, essentially, but it wasn't about getting clients. It was about letting people know that that state of disenfranchisement and the collateral consequences that come from not having your civil rights, which is, quite frankly, devastating to your ability to get housing and employment. To let folks know that it didn't have to be that way. By halfway through my second summer, I think I was committed that I liked it here. I wanted to be here. I had family here who ended up moving away eventually. That wasn't the only reason, but I liked North Carolina a lot. It felt to me like an area where there was good to be done, but strong progressive traditions, and North Carolina, quite frankly, is a very interesting place to be too if you're interested in voting rights, because a lot of the major cases relating to the Voting Rights Act specifically have come out of North Carolina. So I thought this would be a great place to be. So I knew I signed up, started doing all of the paperwork to apply to the North Carolina bar, and I signed up for the North Carolina bar exam. And it was weird my last year in law school, because my law school was a regional law school. They didn't really place a lot of people in North Carolina. It was right before the hiring nightmare. So that was the people were still getting jobs when I was graduating law school. The next year was terrible. So my law school had some career services connections with the banking industry in Charlotte. But that was the only way really they were placing people in North Carolina. So I knew they were not going to be of much help. So when I moved up here, I didn't have a job yet. I was doing tons of networking with my connections from my prior 2 jobs, trying to figure out what I was going to do. And I ended up having a meeting with Anita, who's my current boss. Anita Earls is the executive director of the Southern Coalition for Social Justice. I had a meeting with her about coming to work there 2 weeks before I took the bar exam. And then I started working right after the bar exam. And so I worked for the Southern Coalition for Social Justice, and that's where I've worked since I've started practicing. So almost 5 years now. The Shelby decision came down in June of last year, and there had been a bill, House Bill 589. It was introduced before the Shelby County case came down, before we lost Section 5, but it was it was a voter ID law. It was going to require picture ID for every voter, and it was really problematic. And it got introduced in April and passed by the House in April, and then it went over to the Senate, and it just did nothing. And we knew that the reason it wasn't going anywhere was the Senate and the whole leadership of the legislature was waiting to see what happened with the Voting Rights Act. And the day that the Voting Rights Act, Section 5, was essentially invalidated, we had a leading senator say, well, hey, now House Bill 589, everything's on the table. It doesn't just have to be voter ID. And then 2 days, literally 48 hours before the session ended, we saw a revised version of House Bill 589. It went from somewhere around 17 pages before and went to almost 60 afterwards. It was a stricter voter ID requirement. It cut a week off of early voting. It repealed same-day registration. It ended the counting of out-of-precinct provisional ballots, and it restructured campaign finance laws, upped contribution limits, killed public financing for judicial elections, because let's buy our judges. That's going to make things a lot better. But it dramatically rewrote North Carolina election law. We got the clues from Senator Apodaca the day that Shelby came down that was going to happen, and then we saw it at the very end of session rammed through with no meaningful discourse. It rewrote almost every section of North Carolina election code, and it was the justifications that we heard in that one committee meeting and on the floor in the floor debate were so pretextual and so wrong that it was a little bit mind-boggling. So they described it as they described needing to pass this huge omnibus bill. They said they needed to do it to modernize North Carolina's election code because it hadn't been revised in so long. Early voting was introduced in 2000. Same-day registration was enacted in 2007. The clarification about the rules of relating to out-of-precinct voting was 2005. Pre-registration for 16 and 17-year-olds was the late 2000s. Everything they changed was a relatively newer introduction to the way we run elections. Generally speaking, when it comes to litigation around voting rights, most people don't really have a deep understanding of what's going on or what the Voting Rights Act is about. Education has always been, I think that's why I love where I work, that the education and partnering with grassroots community organizing is central. That people can't assert their rights under the Voting Rights Act unless they know what their rights are under the Voting Rights Act. And so we do spend a lot of time going out into communities and giving presentations on what the Voting Rights Act is, what it prohibits, what you can do if there's a problem. But certainly we can't monitor every voting change in every jurisdiction all across the South, and we work all across the South. So we rely on individuals, activists, and grassroots community organizations to let us know when there's a voting problem. But for them to know when there will be a voting problem, we have to do this education and outreach on that. So yeah, it's always been a challenge, and it's led to things slipping through the cracks. But it's worse now. Under Section 5, jurisdictions were required to give some notice about voting changes. So they had to let especially if they were a covered jurisdiction, they had to give notice to the Department of Justice, and the Department of Justice had to post it online. So we could monitor. It helped us monitor. It helped communities monitor what was going on, and that doesn't exist anymore. And so it was. Now it's harder to get folks, to make sure folks know what's going on, know what their rights are, and know if there's a threat to those rights, if there's a voting change in the work that's going to make it harder for communities of color to participate in the political process.
Produced by Duke University.